Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Delisting the Gray Wolf. What does it mean for its future? Presented by wildlife biologist and NatHab expedition leader, Aaron Bott. It's a pleasure to have you with us today, Aaron. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. I'm excited to be giving this presentation today. We've got a lot of material to cover, and I hope to leave enough time for questions at the end of this. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We are going to be talking about a lot of policies and legal actions today, so please be patient with me, and I promise you that we won't get lost in the weeds. By way of introduction, I'm a wildlife biologist. I specialize in large carnivore management and conservation. Primarily, my research is focused on wolves in the Yellowstone and Idaho region. I got my graduate degree working with the Yellowstone Wolf Project, researching wolves in the park's interior, and source sink dynamics is the current proposal for my PhD that I'm working on in that area. I also work with grizzly bears and cougars and a number of other wildlife species in the Intermountain West. My family's been in the American West for the last 7 generations. We have histories of ranching and farming in the area, a lot of cultural pride out here for the habitat and the wilderness that we have in the Rockies. And this topic about wolves has a particular soft spot in my heart, so I'm excited to be talking to you all about this today. So, for context, on October 29th, 2020, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced the gray wolf would be removed from the federal Endangered Species Act. In their statement to the press, they said, after more than 45 years as a listed species, the gray wolf has exceeded all conservation goals for recovery. This species is neither a threatened nor endangered species based on the specific factors Congress has laid out in the law. So what? We're gonna put on the brakes really quick. In order to fully understand what the future of this species will be like in terms of management and conservation, we need to have a bigger understanding of the species as well as the policies that have been enforced historically to protect this animal, and how those policies are going to change and be adapted now that the species is being proposed for a delisting. So really quick for background in the natural history of these animals, kind of a wolf 101. Gray wolves, Canis lupus, are the largest of the world's canids. They have an average lifespan of 3 to 5 years in the wild, but they can reach 12 years or older. But because of their highly dynamic lifestyle, because it's tough being a wolf, and they are particularly territorial and violent towards one another, their lifespan is generally cut short, again, 3 to 5 years in the wild. The average body mass of a wolf is 110 pounds for males, 90 pounds for females, and this varies quite extensively depending on the region that the wolves are from. So here in the contiguous United States, especially up in the northern Rockies, it's pretty average to have wolves ranging around 100 pounds. The gestation of these animals is 63 days, so they typically breed in the northern latitudes, generally around February and into March, and then they'll whelp, or they'll give birth in April. Litter size is 6, and on average 4 to 5 pups will survive their first year. A pack consists of at least 2 dominant breeders and typically multiple generations of offspring. An average pack size is usually 6 to 10 animals. Now, I'm about to state the obvious, but it's important for us to remember that wolves are carnivores, so they are animals that feed on flesh, or they depend on flesh. And in order to survive, the wolf must kill and eat other animals. It's this obvious fact that makes the wolf a very controversial species. And throughout our interaction with wolves, as far back as human history goes, we've had kind of a a very interesting and complicated relationship with these animals, as well as with all other carnivores. Provided with good habitat, wolves are very prolific. They're extremely fecund, and I want you all to remember this because this is important in terms of appreciating the biology of this species and their adaptability as a species, particularly here in the contiguous United States. We're talking about their recovery and their eventual delisting from the endangered species list, and it comes down in a great part to their capability as breeders and their reproductive successes, which explain why they were ultimately delisted or have been proposed for a delisting. So populations can increase at mean rates of 20% per year. That's quite incredible. Going back one slide, I'll remind you that wolves breed once a year, and their litter is typically 6 animals, and 4 to 5 pups will survive their first year. So they are very prolific, they're very fecund, which says a lot to the success of this species recovery throughout particularly the northern Rocky Mountains and the Great Lakes region. Again, a quick refresher, the gray wolf is an whole Arctic species, which means that it's found pretty much everywhere north of the equator. If you're interested in learning more about the natural history of wolves, I've given a presentation in the past for Natural Habitat talking about wolves and their recovery and reintroduction into the northern Rocky Mountains. This is the 25th anniversary for their reintroduction when they were brought into Yellowstone National Park. I'm not going to go into a lot of those details in this presentation. Again, if you're interested in learning more about that, you can refer to those other presentations that I've offered on wolves. But Canis lupus is has one of the greatest distributions across the planet of any species. In fact, after humans, they have the largest terrestrial range. The current global population estimates for the gray wolf are around 300,000. You can see that the same species goes into Asia and into Europe, all the way down into the tip of Africa. And of course, once upon a time, they covered all of North America, not just Alaska and Canada, but they ranged down through the US, the contiguous US, and into Mexico. Today, the lower 48 states has a population of more than 6,000 wolves. Again, humans and wolves have a complicated history, and it's not just a Euro-American thing. It's not a Wild West thing. People have had a complex relationship with large carnivores for as long as humans have been around. We compete for the same food sources. A lot of our fairy tales talk about wolves attacking and devouring people in villages. There definitely have been wolf attacks and predation on people historically. And a lot of these stories kind of reflect our cognitive fears and anxieties about this animal, as well as our respect for this animal. Just like humans, wolves live in and use social group units, so they help raise offspring that don't even belong to themselves, and they work together to successfully make a living on the landscape. Setting aside perhaps our hyperbolized conflicts with wolves, as well as our realistic conflicts with wolves historically, really everything boils down to this picture here, which I really like. We have economic conflicts with wolves today. Our society is an agrarian society. We depend on livestock. We have depended on livestock in the past, the recent past, and wolves, they like to eat what we have to raise, and so this has caused a lot of conflict. So again, I'm going to briefly go over the history of the wolf in North America, but during Euro-American settlement, we had a great expansion into the West, and native wildlife populations like the bison and elk and pronghorn collapsed as we had unregulated slaughter and harvest of these animals for commercial gain. And as these wildlife populations collapsed, we replaced them with a lot of domestic livestock, sheep and cattle, and wolf populations, as well as other carnivore populations like mountain lions and grizzly bears, they began to adapt their diets to preying on the livestock that we had put in place of the native wildlife populations that these animals were typically accustomed to hunting and eating. So eventually the US Bureau of Biological Survey initiated predator control in the 1915 to 1931, and we got really good at eliminating our predators. Wolves became the victim primarily of poisons. We had traps and we had firearms, but really poison is what was the undoing for the wolf. And by the 1970s, wolves had been extirpated from the contiguous United States, with the exception of a small population in the Great Lakes region up on the Minnesota-Canada border by what is today Voyager National Park. So we went from having historically probably 1 million in the contiguous United States to essentially just a couple dozen up on the Canadian border. Well, sentiments changed, and again, it has the story is pretty complex, but eventually biologists began to understand science a little bit better, and we began to appreciate carnivores and what they meant for our ecosystems. And a long story short, in 1973, we created the Endangered Species Act. We recognized that we had been mismanaging not only carnivores, but many other species, and we recognized an incredible collaborative effort between different political parties in the United States that humans can impact their environment, and we have an ethical responsibility for being good stewards to protect the environment and other species on the landscape. Again, it's hard to believe it, but this was a universal decision among our politicians pretty much back in the 1970s, and it was finally signed into law by Congress in the Nixon administration in 1973. So pay attention to this next part because it's important. So we've set the background for this story. We've talked about wolves, what they are, their history on the landscape, and how their population collapsed in the lower 48 states. And then we had the creation of the Endangered Species Act. So how does that change everything? Well, shifting gears here, let's talk about policies, specifically here in the United States. In the United States, we have what is known as the Public Trust Doctrine, which recognizes the public right to natural resources, including wildlife. This is a revolutionary idea which dates back to Greek and Roman times, the Magna Carta, and eventually became popular in the United States in terms of natural resource management. But it's this concept that wildlife, air, water, these natural resources cannot be owned by an individual. That wildlife in specific, since that's what we're talking about, they belong to everyone in the United States. It's one of the great democratic blessings that we have here in this country. So first, we have the Public Trust Doctrine. Second, we have the US Constitution's 10th Amendment. So we have agreed as a country that wildlife and natural resources cannot be owned by one person. They belong to everyone. They belong to the community at large. But who is going to manage and govern these natural resources according to what the public dictates? So who is going to be the sovereign power? What is going to be the sovereign power that will manage wildlife populations? Well, according to the US Constitution's 10th Amendment, the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved for the states respectively, or to the people. So to put that in a nutshell, states have the responsibility to manage wildlife on behalf of the public, unless otherwise stated. So these founding fathers, they were putting together the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. They were preoccupied with building a nation and a government that would work. And wildlife management was not on their agenda. They weren't really thinking about that. So sort of by default, wildlife in the United States became the responsibility of each respective state to manage it on behalf of the people, their desires, and their needs, not just for current generations, but for future generations. Well, these sentiments were great, but oops. All of us should be familiar with the Great Slaughter of the 19th century. Across America, we had the mass commercialization of hunting, and we began to destroy habitat for wildlife as well as wildlife populations for primarily avarice reasons. We were interested in commercial gain. It was exciting to be an individual and learn that you had the ability to own wildlife when your forefathers or perhaps yourself had come from a country where wildlife was owned by the monarchs or the rulers of the land. So suddenly people wanted to capitalize on all of these wildlife populations, all these herds that were living out here. So it wasn't very long after we had created this new nation that people began to exploit the natural resources. They began to particularly exploit the wildlife. This is the tragedy of the commons. People looked for personal gain, and because there was very little regulation actually enforcing wildlife preservation, wildlife populations across North America collapsed at an alarming rate. So, kind of picking up speed slowly, beginning in the 1870s, state wildlife agencies were established to conserve wildlife populations for the public. 1870s, not 1970s. So the public's perception and interaction with wildlife is pretty different in the 1870s than it is with our conception of wildlife conservation today. But states, as territory got transformed into states or evolved into a state, they created game wardens or positions of authority that would protect and manage and conserve wildlife so that they would not be completely exploited for individual use or commercial gain. So no matter what state you're living in, if you're in the United States, every single state has a wildlife agency. It is responsible for protecting and conserving wildlife, according to the 10th Amendment, for your desires and needs. Traditionally, people have utilized wildlife for consumptive purposes. So hunting and fishing agencies are typically what these organizations are called. These groups, these government officials are called. Regardless of their name, they actually administer and manage wildlife for all citizens, not just for hunters and anglers. So whatever state you're in, whether it's Nebraska, Arizona, Wyoming, New York, you have a wildlife state agency, and they are responsible for managing wildlife according to each state's citizens' desires. Now, again, jumping back to the 10th Amendment, states manage wildlife. That's in the Constitution. Now, that can be superseded if wildlife populations are deemed imperiled, and this is where the Endangered Species Act comes into play. So the Endangered Species Act is the biggest muscle that the federal government has in terms of conserving and preserving wildlife from extinction. We have several other wildlife laws that protect wildlife, but it's the Endangered Species Act that is the big gun. It is the muscle that our nation has to preserve and to protect wildlife. So if a state mismanages its wildlife, or if a wildlife population in a state or multiple states falls into a category where it is considered by biologists to be imperiled, the federal government will step in and say, hey, hold it. We are going to oversee the protection and recovery of this species. And we are going to help you, the states, the tribes, whomever, work to see this population, this species, be recovered so it is no longer in danger of going extinct. So the two agencies that deal with this by order of the federal government are the U.S. Department of the Interior's Fish and Wildlife Service. They primarily handle everything on land, and the Commerce Department's National Marine Fisheries Service, which administer administer the ESA applying to marine wildlife and fisheries. So these two organizations these two departments of the federal government step in when states need help protecting a species or conserving a species. And essentially, the purpose of the Endangered Species Act is to help recovered imperiled species and the ecosystems upon which they depend. But ultimately, the goal is to have the species become recovered. You don't want it to be indefinitely imperiled, endangered, or threatened. You want to see that population be recovered. And the goal is, as soon as that population is no longer threatened, the state will then once again begin managing wildlife. So, under the Endangered Species Act, species may be listed as either endangered or threatened. Endangered: a species is in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. Threatened: a species is likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. So these are the two categorizations that a species can be listed as if it is imperiled. Endangered is immediate action must be taken to protect this animal or this organism, or it will vanish. Threatened is less severe. Threatened is the species is shaky. It's possible that it could become endangered in the foreseeable future, so we're going to protect it. Now, interestingly enough, all species of plants and animals except pest insects are eligible for listing as an endangered or threatened species. So this does not just apply to wildlife, it also applies to plants and some insects. Now, Congress has defined species to include subspecies, varieties, and distinct population segments. So let's put everything on hold for a second. In the lower 48 states, wolves were extirpated. They were removed by force. We made plans to annihilate them in the lower 48 states, and by the 1970s, we had done it. But globally, wolves were doing just fine as a population. They were not endangered of going extinct. They were not even threatened. Their habitat had been greatly reduced, and other countries were persecuting wolves as well. But the great wildernesses of North America, as well as Eurasia, were still providing sufficient habitat for this species to be okay on a global basis. Wolves, however, were listed early on in the Endangered Species Act as an endangered, and in the Midwest as a threatened species. They were designated as distinct population segments, or DPS. So in certain regions, they were considered endangered. Globally, at this time in the 1970s, wolves were still okay. They definitely weren't as good as they had been 200 years prior to the 1970s, but they were still doing okay. However, we decided that we needed to act to help recover this regionally endangered species in the lower 48 states. So gray wolves have a very complicated relationship with the Endangered Species Act. They were one of the first species listed as endangered. The Endangered Species Act, I should say the Endangered Species Preservation Act, which was the predecessor to the Endangered Species Act, listed wolves as an endangered species in 1967, and then they were legally protected in the official Endangered Species Act that came out in 1973, just a year after it was created. So in 1974, wolves became one of the first species that was protected by the Endangered Species Act. Now, this helps us to understand how the complications with wolves and the ESA have kind of evolved and snowballed together. When you ask people who are wildlife savvy about the Endangered Species Act to list 5 species that have been on the Endangered Species Act, usually the wolf is among those first 5 that come to mind. The wolf has had a complicated relationship with the ESA, in part because it's had growing pains with the ESA. As the ESA has tried to figure out how to recover a species, the wolf has been kind of a guinea pig that has experienced the same growing pangs that the ESA has had. Now, there's no doubt that the ESA is a positive thing. It's phenomenal. Again, it's the biggest muscle that we have in this nation in terms of wildlife conservation and preservation. The ESA helped to protect wolf populations in the lower 48 states and help those populations be recovered in areas. After the initial protection status of 1974, we began to focus on recovery efforts in the northern Rocky Mountains, that's Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. And wolves began to recolonize those states naturally in the 1980s. They came down from Canada all on their own. They were protected as an endangered species. And then we took the initiative to actually do the first ever translocation or reintroduction program of any large species, which was mind-blowing. It's the reason why the wolf reintroduction program in Yellowstone and in Idaho was so groundbreaking and exciting, because we had never done a physical translocation of a species from one area to another area and had as much success as we saw here with the gray wolf. So in the northern Rocky Mountains, we had a fantastic story to tell. Again, I'm not going to go into the details in this presentation, but I am going to hash out some of the bullet points that are important for us to remember as we proceed with this presentation. So the northern Rocky Mountain wolf population has been listed as a distinct population segment. So it is kind of like a cookie cutter taken out of the lower 48 states, where we have Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, where we focused on restoring a wolf population. The reason why we chose those three states, that area, that ecological region, was because it has a lot of wilderness. And it also has a lot of natural food resources for the wolves. The elk populations and the buffalo populations in Ohio are not what they used to be. However, in Montana and Idaho and Wyoming, they're still doing pretty well. So we reintroduced wolves into the northern Rocky Mountains. Also, I want to say that we chose these states not only because the resources were available for the wolves, but also because there are less people in those three states. And so the conflict between wolf and human, the odds of a conflict between wolf and human were less than they would be in other states or other regions where wolves historically ranged. So in 1995 and 1996, we went up to Canada and British Columbia and Alberta, and we brought down 66 wolves, and we reintroduced them into Idaho and Yellowstone. Not just Yellowstone, it was Idaho as well. And then in 2005, again, because these animals are so fecund, their biological objectives were met. And so in 2005, just 10 years after we'd reintroduced the wolves, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service began to toss the idea around of delisting this distinct region of wolves, this distinct population of wolves. Proposals were made in 2008, but there were legal challenges. People thought that there should be more wolves. They didn't really agree on how many wolves there should be or shouldn't be. These same issues are happening today with this delisting that we've got. We haven't figured out how to smooth all of the wrinkles, and we'll talk more about these details in just a second. But ultimately, a congressional directive in 2011 ordered that wolves in Montana and Idaho, as well as parts of Utah, Washington, and Oregon, would delist the wolf in the northern Rocky Mountains as a distinct population segment. And ultimately, in 2017, wolves were finally delisted as well. So prior to October 29th, 2020, the wolves in the lower 48 states that were delisted from the endangered species list lived in northern Utah, eastern Oregon, eastern Washington, and Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. And the states have the authority to manage that wolf population according to the state's needs. Now, quick, just to explain more about the Endangered Species Act. To date, there are 2,244 species listed as either threatened or endangered on the endangered species list. 1,608 18 of those species are within the United States. Around 2.1% of all species ever listed on the endangered species list have been delisted due to recovery. The Endangered Species Act budget fluctuates around $250 million annually, which scientists say is 3.5% of what is needed to see the full recovery of each of those species that is listed by the ESA. Wolf recovery to date has cost approximately $160 million. Now, the reason why I'm presenting these figures to you, and they're very controversial because the Endangered Species Act, again, is in a lot of ways a success story. It's a fantastic tool that we have. There are some criticisms about having the wolf continually at the forefront of the Endangered Species Act. The wolf, just like the grizzly bear and the bald eagle, it's a charismatic species. People care a lot about it, but it is one species out of 2,244 that need help, that are at risk of going extinct. There is a lot of help that these species need, and there's not a lot of money to go around to help protect and preserve these species. The butterflies, the beetles, the plants, those are on the back burner. And to show you that to date, the wolf recovery program in the US has cost $160 million just in the Northern Rockies. That's a significant chunk of the money or the budget allocated for the ESA that is supposed to be responsible for protecting and helping recover all these 2,000 plus species. So one of the biggest arguments that people who want to see the wolf delisted use is the wolf isn't really endangered, and we don't have a lot of money, and there are other species that are on the verge of going extinct, not just regionally, but they will be gone from the face of the earth. It is time for us to move beyond the charismatic species, to have a success story, and to utilize our finite budget to help protect and preserve other species that are about to be gone forever. That's a criticism that is often made. So quick, now we're going to jump back to October 29th, 2020, just a couple of weeks ago, when the Department of the Interior announced that they were going to delist the gray wolf in the lower 48 states. Before I proceed, I want to let you all know that I am doing my best to give you the facts. I'm not going to tell you how to think. That's absolutely not my goal. I hope that by presenting these facts to you, both sides of the story, whether or not you're in favor of the delisting, I hope that you'll be able to make educated and rational decisions on your own. There are very good arguments that support the delisting. A lot of very, very renowned biologists that know what they're talking about support the delisting. There are a lot of very renowned biologists that do not support the delisting. This argument is a good one because both sides make some good points. So I'm not going to tell you what you should believe or what you should think, but I do hope that you'll begin to stir your own inner curiosity and continue to do research beyond this presentation to make up your own mind. So to date, we have over 6,000 wolves in the lower 48 states. The Northern Rocky Mountain population, again, is a distinct population that was delisted in 2011 and then again in 2017. The Great Lakes have the largest wolf population in the contiguous United States, over 4,000, and they have still been protected by the ESA. There have been several tentative delistings in the past, but they've been protected by the Endangered Species Act until October 29th, 2020. Of course, we have a small subspecies of gray wolf. It's the same species, just a subspecies in the American Southwest, and then a separate species, the red wolf, in the East. We'll talk about those later. But as of October 2020, what is being proposed? The gray wolf will be removed from the list of endangered species in the contiguous United States. this will not affect the Mexican gray wolf, which is a subspecies in the Southwest, or the red wolf, which is a different species in the East. So both of those groups, both of those species or subspecies will continue to be protected by the Endangered Species Act. This also does not affect wolf populations protected in national parks. People ask me that. Are wolves now going to be hunted in Yellowstone? No, national parks are off limit to hunting in most cases. Looking at the recovery efforts in the Great Lakes region, I'd like to show you that Minnesota's population, which remember had kind of the cradle of wolves that were left as a remnant after the great annihilation of wolves in the 1800s and early 1900s. Today, the wolf population in Minnesota, where hunting and state management is not allowed, state management is cooperative with federal management in order to protect the species. The population is over 2,000, pushing up to 3,000 individual wolves within the state. Wisconsin, you can see, went from essentially no wolves in the 1980s to today. We've got over 900 wolves, pushing 1,000 wolves. And Michigan, which has an estimated population of around 600 to 700 wolves a day, again, from essentially nothing in the early 1980s. Wolves, again, are tremendous breeders. They're very fecund, and they disperse long distances. Wolves were made to walk. And it's because of their biology that we've seen an increase of wolves throughout the contiguous United States as they expand their range. Now, this is very important for people to realize too, is that just because a species is delisted, that doesn't mean that it's open season and that the state now has the ability to annihilate wolves, especially if their politicians are very anti-wolf. That's not how it works. That's absolutely not how it works. When a species is delisted, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the federal government, will continue to monitor the populations for up to 5 years or longer, depending on the species and the concerns, to ensure the continued success of the species. So it's not like, all right, we did a good job, we're going to pat ourselves on the back and walk away. Nope, the federal government will continue to manage, or co-manage, I should say, the species and monitor its population, but really the ball is now in the state's court. They're going to determine how they're going to build their own wolf management program. Also, if the population drops significantly, then the species will be relisted as an endangered species or a threatened species. So again, it's not like people were concerned that Idaho would annihilate all of its wolves as soon as management got passed to the state. That's not going to happen, because if the state's population dropped significantly, it would once again become federally protected. Now, it's easy to politicize the wolf, especially in this day and age when everything seems to be hyper politicized. But it's oversimplifying everything by simply saying that one administration is pro-wolf and one administration is anti-wolf. Sure, they have influence, but the wolf, again, has been listed and delisted repeatedly throughout many administrations over the last 45 years. One reason that some people argue to keep wolves on the endangered species list is to protect them from hunting. Wolves need to be protected by the Endangered Species Act, otherwise they will be hunted. That is a very bad reason. That is a very, very bad reason to keep an animal or a species listed as endangered. The purpose of the Endangered Species Act is to help imperiled species recover from the brink of extinction. To use this tool to further alternative agendas, for example, opposition to hunting, is an abuse of its powers. If a species is listed as endangered, it's true. You can no longer hunt it if it was ever legal to hunt it in the first place. But if a species has recovered, to continually beg for it to be protected federally to prevent further harvest, especially in the case of a wolf, which it's non-consumptive hunting, it's considered a trophy animal, that does not sit well with a lot of people. It doesn't sit well with me personally, but my personal feelings set aside, You cannot use and abuse the Endangered Species Act to protect a species from being hunted if it's no longer endangered or imperiled. That's breaking the Endangered Species Act if you continually try and push for it to be protected. And eventually, that's ultimately where you get the largest pushback for Endangered Species Act critics. Again, it's just an abuse of that power. Another point I want to make is that states have the constitutional right to manage wildlife. So to indefinitely federally protect a species like the wolf is not our goal. That's not the purpose. We hope to protect a species and recover a species until it reaches a stable point, a viable point where it can be delisted, at which time we will return the management back to the states. And the state then has the responsibility to manage that wildlife species according to the desires of the public within that state. So states have a constitutional right to manage wildlife, and states have the ability to accept wolves as part of their wildlife community with or without hunting. Oftentimes people jump to the conclusion that immediately if a species like a wolf is delisted or a grizzly bear is delisted, then a hunting season is going to open up and people are going to start shooting wolves left and right. Tragically, that happens, but the state is still responsible for managing that population and making sure that it stays viable, that it doesn't decrease to a point where it becomes imperiled again. And the opposite can happen. States like California, which already have superseded the ESA in some ways by saying that we have our own Endangered Species Act, we are going to continually protect the wolf regardless of whether it is federally protected or not. So the state of California at the moment has said we're going to continue to protect wolves. It doesn't matter if they're federally listed as endangered. We consider them endangered or imperiled here in this state because we only have at the moment one breeding pair. So we need to encourage that population to increase before we can open up a hunting season. Similarly, Washington and Oregon, sure, they have a lot of conflict with wolves up there, but they have decided that they're going to protect the species throughout their range until eventually they become more prolific and more permanent on the landscape. Now, if the wolf is delisted, is that going to slow down or stop the gray wolf expansion? That's again one of the critiques that is made is sure, you have two large population segments. You have the Northern Rocky Mountains and the Great Lakes. You don't have wolves in Ohio. You don't have wolves in Utah. You don't have really wolves to speak of in Colorado yet. We'll talk about that in a second. Sure, they are dispersing. We're seeing wolves in Illinois. We're seeing occasionally wolves come down from the Northern Rockies and get into California. It's been exciting, and this has been a biological process that has taken place because the animal is federally protected. But now that we are delisting the species, is it going to stop this expansion? Will it negatively affect established populations where, like in Minnesota, they're probably going to start hunting wolves? Will it decrease the population size to the point that they don't continue to expand? Now, these are questions I don't have the answers to. And again, I'm not wanting to portray or to push my agenda or my opinions on you, but I hope you consider these things. By delisting the wolf population, are you going to limit its expansion? Now, this is where the current schism, I guess, takes place in the recovery efforts of the ESA. Recovery is a loose word, and it's interpreted differently by different people. In the language of the Endangered Species Act, people get nitpicky about what is recovered and what isn't recovered. So in this statement made by the US Department of the Interior, quote, recovery is bringing the population of gray wolves in the lower 48 states to the point where they are no longer in danger of extinction now or in the foreseeable future. This is a true statement. According to the Department of the Interior, wolves are not endangered, they're not imperiled, they're not going to go extinct in the lower 48 states. That's a fact. They're not endangered. They're not going to go extinct. Now, on the flip side, a criticism of this current delisting that has been proposed is wolves occupy less than 20% of their historic range in the lower 48 states. That is also true. So wolves, sure, they are not endangered of going extinct in the lower 48 states, but they only inhabit a fraction of their possible range and only a very small fraction of their historic range. This is where you get the debate. This is where you get people who support the current delisting saying, listen, why should we protect wolves as endangered if they're not endangered? And then the alternative, the argument being, we have habitat where wolves should be and they're not. We only have 2 populations in the Northern Rockies and in the Great Western Lakes, the Western Great Lakes, where we have wolf populations. What about all of that historic land in between? And what about the current areas where wolf habitat is possible, but we don't have wolves? So I really like this map. Unfortunately, it's a bit dated. It's from 2011, but all of the dark gray areas are determined by biologists and ecologists to be suitable wolf habitat. We have wolves again in the Great Lakes states, and we also have wolves in the Northern Rocky Mountains, but there's a lot of habitat in between, specifically down through Utah and into Colorado, down through California, and even into the northeastern region of the United States where wolf habitat is possible. Occasionally we've had transient wolves come down from the Northern Rockies and go down into Utah and into Colorado, as well as up into Maine and the northeastern states. But compared to that light gray color, I hope you can see it, but that's the historic range of where the gray wolf used to live. There are areas where we're not going to have wolves back. It's just not practical. Again, you look at Nebraska, it doesn't have the wildlife populations able to support wolves. The habitat is gone. So although they used to historically range there, realistically, it's not a good place for wolves to live anymore, and that's just the ugly truth of it. However, we do have a lot of areas where wolf habitat still is available, especially in the American West, but we don't have wolves yet. So should we be delisting wolves when we still have habitat that's available to them? Everything comes down to range and the interpretation of range. This is a quote from a paper that is criticizing the current delisting. It's actually criticizing the proposal, which was made back in 2019. The wolf delisting proposal forms part of this effort to advance a minimalist interpretation of the ESA's mandate, in that its central premise goes beyond what is necessary to support wolf delisting and seeks to establish a precedent that the ESA allows for a narrow view of what constitutes recovery of a widely distributed species. So again, the Department of the Interior is saying, we've looked at the science, this species is not endangered. And the critics are saying, well, yeah, but they might not be endangered, but they certainly aren't recovered because a lot of their range, or the range that is available for them to inhabit, is still unoccupied. So this is coming from the Department of the Interior defending their decision to delist the wolf, and I quote, "The act does not require us to restore the gray wolf or any other species to all of its historical range, or even to a minority of the currently suitable habitat. Instead, the act requires that we recover listed species such that they no longer meet the definitions of threatened species or endangered species, i.e. are no longer in danger of extinction now or in the foreseeable future." So again, according to this interpretation made by the Department of the Interior, they have fulfilled their obligations as they interpret the Endangered Species Act. They have helped to recover a species that is no longer in danger of going extinct in the lower 48 states. And that is true. The wolf is not going to go extinct in the lower 48 states anytime soon. But according to the critics' interpretation of the Endangered Species Act, the Department of the Interior is jumping the gun. Their criticism again is, quote, "The US government has proposed the removal of the gray wolf from the list of protected species on the basis of a claim that the statute permits a species to be declared recovered given the existence of a single presently secure population." So criticism of the Department of the Interior's decision to delist the wolf is, you're jumping the gun. Sure, you're saying that we have one population, or in this case, two populations that are viable, that they're healthy and well, genetically viable. That's true. But you are misinterpreting the statute in the Act, in the Endangered Species Act. And wolves, in this case, should be given an opportunity to inhabit as much feasible habitat as possible, not just the minimum amount in order for them to be delisted. So this is what it boils down to: interpretation of the Endangered Species Act. What is recovery? If the purpose of the ESA is only to prevent the complete extinction of a species, is the extinction of a single secure population sufficient to declare a species recovered? That's a question that I don't have the answer to, and that's what the legal debates are going to be digging into over the next several months. And of course, on November 5th, the first legal challenges were made regarding this delisting. Does a species need to achieve recovery in all or a majority of its historical range before it can be delisted? Again, it's open to interpretation right now, and people who oppose the delisting say yes, and people who are for the delisting say no. If the goal lies somewhere in between, how can appropriate recovery goals be established? That's what we have to find out. Wolves are a charismatic species. They definitely evoke a lot of emotion, and they're an incredible part of the landscape. Ecologically, they are important, but they're also challenging neighbors in this modern world where the human population is growing and wilderness is shrinking. These are large, efficient predators that need to kill for food. They're prolific, they reproduce quickly, they disperse long distances, they can readily recolonize areas where humans allow them, and they're difficult to control when they become established. These are management issues that states and the federal government have to consider. Now, quickly, I can't talk about the delisting without talking about the exciting proposal that was made on the ballot initiative in Colorado, and how this comes into play. But on November 3rd, just this past November 3rd, a week or so ago, Colorado citizens voted on a ballot initiative, which was ballot initiative 114, to support wolf reintroduction into the western part of the state. This is pretty groundbreaking. It's the first time voters, not federal wildlife biologists, have directed wildlife officials to reintroduce a species, any species. The first time that the public has said, this is what we want, and the state has to act accordingly. It's not the federal government that's going to act accordingly. Remember, that's how it works. States manage wildlife. So if the public wants something, the state should, if it's being democratic like it should, has to adhere to what the state citizens want. Now, this vote went through, this ballot initiative went through on November 3rd, just a couple weeks ago, and it passed, but barely. It passed by a majority of 50.6%. That is pretty hairy, if you're going to ask me. People have been asking me about Colorado's stance on reintroducing wolves for a long time now. I will share my opinion with you that I think that that's alarming that it was so close. In a state that is supposed to be progressive in terms of its wildlife management, that had been projected to be very strongly in favor of the reintroduction, that 50.6% is a really close win. And sure, it is a success for the wolf. But at the same time, I have to ask, is it? Because that's a lot of citizens that are willing to be publicly active, politically active, that are opposed to the wolf's reintroduction. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. So wolves will be reintroduced into the state of Colorado on the west side of the Continental Divide by December 31st, 2023. So what happens now? The state decided they want to reintroduce wolves, regardless of what the federal government's stance on wolves are. In fact, it's actually kind of a blessing in disguise. If the wolf is delisted, then the state has more authority to manage wolves in its own jurisdiction. So that's kind of a good thing for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. So currently, the state's wildlife agency is putting together a plan that will include input from statewide hearings, so everyone in the state of Colorado should get involved. They should talk to their legislatures, as well as get involved personally at these state wildlife regional meetings. And Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the state agency, although they've confirmed several sightings of wolves in the state of Colorado as of 2020, they're going to move forward with a reintroduction program, and wolves will be reintroduced, captured in the Northern Rockies probably, and reintroduced into the state of Colorado by the end of 2023. So as I wrap this up, I'm reaching the top of the hour, and I appreciate everyone who has stayed with me on this subject. You might be asking yourself, well, what should I do? Here I am, I'm a nature lover. I tuned into today because I care about wildlife. Specifically, I'm interested in wolves. I don't know if I should be excited about the delisting or if I should be upset by the delisting. Well, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I think this is something that every individual needs to get involved with, and they need to do their own scientific research. The last thing we want is to govern our wildlife management decisions based off of emotion. That's why we annihilated wolves in the first place. Our emotions got the better of us. Everything we do should be founded in science, and we should be doing our own homework so that we have the knowledge and the ability to make educated decisions to support wildlife management in a progressive way. State wildlife management is a democratic process. Regardless of the delisting outcomes, get involved with your state's wildlife management program. Everyone as a citizen who belongs to a state in the United States can get involved. You can have a voice. You can tell your wildlife officials what you want to see now that wolves have been delisted. You can influence your state's wildlife management plan. You can suggest how wolves should or should not be managed. You can't just sit on the sidelines and complain on social media. That's not how you get things done. Unfortunately, that's how the majority of our society thinks we get things done, but it's not how you get things done. Get involved, contact your local state wildlife agency, find out what they are doing now that the wolf has been delisted, and participate in the public hearings, participate in the regional wildlife meetings. In conclusion, I want to just go through several bullet points. Don't get overwhelmed by the words. I know they're all there, but these bullet points were put out by the Wildlife Society, which is one of the world's foremost wildlife research and education programs. It's an international agency, and this is what they had to say about wolves in the lower 48 states, and I really like the points that they made. You can find this on their website. Again, this is an international community of scientists and biologists working to conserve and protect wildlife all over the world. I'm proud to say that I'm a member of the society, and I'd like to, again, really quickly emphasize what they have had to say, because I think it's applicable to all of us. One, recognize that wolves occupy an important ecological niche and that they need to be conserved. They belong on this planet. They should be here. But realistically, we have to plan what areas that they can exist, that they can live. Not all habitat today is as suitable as it was 200 years ago. We have to take into consideration where wolves can be, and we have to work progressively and realistically to try and conserve those environments. Two, recognize the existence of wolf-human conflicts. Wolves and humans do have conflicts. It doesn't make anyone any friendlier if you tell them that the percentage of wolf depredation on livestock is minuscule if they, in fact, are losing livestock to wolves, because it becomes a personal issue. So recognize that there are conflicts and that we have to be aware of those conflicts. Two, encourage continued work with other countries to protect the connectivity of wolf populations throughout North America. It should be something that we're concerned about. Utah has a policy where the state will not allow wolves to ever recolonize in Utah unless the federal government delists the wolf. If you're going to have connectivity with the genetic subspecies, the Mexican gray wolf down in Arizona and New Mexico with the Northern Rocky Mountain population, then they've got to go through Utah most likely. But as long as they're continually protected by the Endangered Species Act, Utah's legislatures have refused to allow wolves to recolonize the state. So in some ways, the delisting is a good thing for certain wolf populations. And then again, maybe it's bad for others. 4, promote habitat conservation. Again, we can't have wolves unless we have things to feed wolves, appropriate things to feed wolves, elk and deer, and we want robust elk and deer populations. So let's do our best to protect habitat everywhere. 5, we can support the wolf restoration and delisting when it is appropriate, when science supports the delisting, and that is what is to be determined as these debates unfold, is find out what the science supports and then get behind the science. Don't let your emotions drive you and run with you. Recognize that state biologists, tribal biologists, they are deeply involved with this species as well, and that they on a personal level care about these animals, and they want to do what's best for the ecosystem as well. 6, encourage inclusion of the concerns of all stakeholders. It's not just about the ranchers, it's not just about the hunters, it's not just about the wildlife enthusiasts. We all are a part of the environment, we're all a part of this table of discussion. And the last 3 points, encourage scientific agencies and organizations to clearly distinguish biology and science from issues that have ethical, political, or legal foundations. Again, I'm pushing the science. We should be getting behind the science and ignoring any other alternative motives for listing or delisting the wolf. 8, encourage adequate public and private funding to support wolf conservation and management. That's what you do, participating in these presentations and working with Natural Habitat Adventures and the World Wildlife Fund to continue to support conservation, and recognize that the Endangered Species List and Act has limitations. It's not foolproof. It's not that old. It was created in the 70s. It's not that old. It's got some growing pains yet, and we're figuring things out together. And it's important to also realize that in many areas, state and tribal agencies can be more efficient and more cost-effective at protecting and managing wolves than federal agencies. Again, sometimes the state has the means and sometimes the federal government doesn't, and vice versa. So thank you all very much for tuning in. I went over the hour, just barely. But again, my purpose today is to encourage you to do your own homework. This proposal to delist the wolf will go into effect at the beginning of January. So right now the proposal has been made. Of course, legal battles will follow. Let's define some terms, but let's also be scientific and proactive and be active on a state level. Get involved. And that's it.
Thank you, Aaron. That was wonderful. We've got a lot of good questions for you, and we'll take questions for another 10 or 15 minutes, I'll say. And I just want to remind folks watching, if you have a question for Aaron, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. All right, first question is, can you explain this a little bit further? The number of species listed on the ESA is over 2,000, and you said that around 1,600 were in the US. Where are the rest located?
So the US works with international agencies and governments to protect and identify species that need to be protected elsewhere. So some of those species are migratory species that we've collaborated with Canada or Mexico or other Mesoamerican or South American countries to protect, as well as as well as other nations across the ocean as well. So these are species that the US acknowledges are endangered and imperiled, and again, the majority of those that we recognize are, of course, in our own backyard. So that's where those numbers come from.
All right, great. And how do states get an accurate count of wolves?
It's a really good question. So, and it's also a very controversial question. Predators are difficult to count. Wildlife in general is difficult to count. We have to go out and do population surveys all the time. But predators are particularly challenging. Wolves, we can be slightly more accurate in counting than we can with mountain lions, for example, because wolves give us an advantage because they adhere to groups. So we do these occupancy surveys in multiple ways. One of the most common ways is to conduct a survey where you're doing aerial flights. You're also putting out game or trail cameras and you're capturing areas on a grid across your state or across your ecoregion where you're trying to determine how many wolves, how many individuals, and what the population and fecundity of that area is. It's complicated, and it involves a lot of modeling and a lot of math and also a lot of groundwork. And so the population estimates usually have a plus or minus. There's a window, I guess you could say, of how many animals or individuals are on the landscape. And one of the criticisms that are used by both people who are for or against wolves is your estimate is off. You're saying we have more wolves than we actually have, and so we should continue to protect them. And the flip side is your estimate's off. We have more wolves than you're saying we have, and we should be delisting them. That being said, we recognize as biologists that there is a little window, a little margin of error, but we can be pretty confident about the numbers that we present based on the modeling systems that we have.
So this question is about the ESA budget and the cost of wolf recovery. What makes the cost for wolves so high?
For Yellowstone and the Northern Rockies, a lot of the conflicts came, or a lot of the costs came from the reintroduction themselves. It costs a lot to employ personnel, biologists, to rent vehicles, equipment, to go out and to capture animals and to relocate them. This is not just with wolves, but with non-endangered species too. To capture and translocate or relocate an animal is thousands of dollars per animal typically. The drugs that are used are expensive. The management, the policies, again, the employment of the personnel, and the time that it takes to have meetings, to have preparation, everything adds up. So it's not typically one major thing. It's not one big thing. It's a lot of little things that get expensive really quickly.
All right, next question is, in terms of the public trust doctrine, if it isn't there or shouldn't have been, or shouldn't there have been fuller consideration for future generations and not strictly current generations that harbor a sense of entitlement to them?
So that comment is absolutely right. So the public trust doctrine is a concept that was then brought into to U.S. administration in the 1840s, but basically it's arguing that, again, natural resources belong to everyone. That was interpreted, or can be interpreted by selfish individuals as meaning this resource benefits me now at this time. But there are a lot of critics who oppose that idea of self-entitlement. Probably the loudest and most boisterous and influential critic of that sentiment was Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th president of the United States of America. I have a couple of presentations that I've given on wildlife management in the United States, and I talk about the public trust doctrine. And Theodore Roosevelt, who was a hunter, he recognized that that commercial gain was a selfish enterprise that was depleting the public of their natural resources. And I wish I could quote for you off the top of my head what he had to say, but he was very passionate in chewing out self-interested parties. So you are right, the public trust doctrine ought to be and has been interpreted as not just for current generations, but also future generations. For, as Theodore Roosevelt said, for generations unborn in the womb of time. So it all depends on how people want to interpret that public trust doctrine. But I will clarify that there are a lot of people who see it as something that is meant to include future generations.
Okay. So there's a question here about the wolf pack that collapsed in Denali National Park after the last remaining alpha female was shot. And aerial hunting of wolves outside of the park has been part of Alaska Board of Game since 2010. And there's a proposal to bring back the buffer to protect wolves after the loss of this pack. Where would this fit into the intent of the ESA?
So wolves have never been protected by the ESA in Alaska. So everything that we talked about today was not applicable to Alaska. Wolf hunting has never been illegal or outlawed in Alaska. That being said, wolf populations in Alaska are managed by the state. And again, the state, in theory, should be managing wildlife populations according to the desires of science, or according to the facts presented, the data presented by science, and the desires of the public, in consideration of future generations as well. That doesn't mean that states always do things correctly. In fact, they can really screw things up, which is why it's so important for the rest of us to be active in our state's wildlife management decisions, because we can be the watchdogs. We can tell them when they're getting things wrong. Aerial gunning is stupid. It's stupid. I understand that there are times when hunting predators and regulating predator populations with trapping and harvests are ecologically acceptable and necessary in some cases when there's additive predation. I don't want to go down those rabbit holes, but I don't think aerial gunning is ever really a method that should be approved. I'm not from Alaska. I'm not an Alaskan citizen, and I don't have any specific details regarding Denali and that wolf pack's collapse. Again, if the park and the state decide to create a buffer, it would be an agreement between the park, Denali, and the state, and where you can and cannot hunt wolves. Similar things have been done around Yellowstone National Park with grizzly bear delisting proposals, etc. But again, the ESA does not at all affect the delisting proposal does not at all affect wolves in Alaska, which were never protected by the ESA.
All right, that was really interesting. So if a listed species recovers to the point where it can be delisted, but its presence is necessary to help another ESA species recover, does the government take that into consideration?
They do. Man, whoever asked that was sharp of you to consider. Absolutely, it does. So, and it can get pretty sticky because you can also have a flip side to that. A second ago, I mentioned additive predation. I'm not going to go into details because we don't have the time for it, but you have compensatory predation, which is when a species like a wolf is keeping an elk population healthy by eating the disease and the sick and the old, etc. Additive predation is when you have not enough elk and you have too many wolves, and the wolves can, in fact, end an elk population, especially if they have a supplemental prey species like mule deer that they're also eating. I did go into the details, I'm sorry. Let me be quick. Regionally, species of Nevada and California bighorn sheep are protected by the ESA. Mountain lions are very abundant in areas where these species are protected. And in California, Southern California, you have an abundance of mountain lions that are consuming a species protected by the Endangered Species Act, to the point that the bighorn sheep population is threatened. It's not going to bounce back unless we do something about the mountain lions. But the mountain lions are protected in the state of California from any hunting or trapping. And so sometimes you do get into these weird binds, policy binds, where you can't delist the species without impacting another species, for good or for ill. Sometimes you have these symbiotic relationships where you need a species to be around and protected in order to help out a species that's still endangered. And sometimes you have a species that is protected, impacting negatively another species that's endangered. Those are really sticky situations, but definitely there's a lot of consideration that goes into that.
All right. Well, Aaron, I'm going to call it there with questions. This has been absolutely fascinating, and I know it's a very complicated subject, but you presented it so well. So thank you so much for presenting for us today. I'm going to hand it back over to you for closing comments.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone stuck with me today. It's definitely an interesting subject. A lot of political things and policy issues to get bogged down in, to get lost in the weeds. But overall, there's a lot of good people that are working very hard to protect wildlife in general, to conserve the biodiversity of this planet, to conserve the biodiversity of this country. It's not as simple as black and white. And I encourage you all to become active in your state's wildlife management. If the delisting does occur as proposed, then your state is going to probably be talking about what to do next with wolves potentially inhabiting your state's boundaries. So I encourage you to be active and to do your homework. Go out there and do good. So thanks very much.
Thanks again, Aaron. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.